Hello. Today, we delve into the depths of medieval history to learn about the life and deeds of one of the most significant and legendary figures of his time, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I Hohenstaufen, known to posterity by the nickname Barbarossa, meaning Redbeard. His name became a symbol of imperial power, knightly valor, and indomitable will, but also of a harsh struggle for power that left a profound mark on the political map of the 12th century. Who was this man, whose life was filled with both great triumphs and crushing defeats? Let's try to find out. Frederick, the future Emperor Barbarossa, was born, as historians believe, around 1122, possibly in or near Weingarten Abbey, though the exact place of his birth remains a subject of debate. This was a period of profound political transformation and instability in the German lands, which formally constituted the core of the Holy Roman Empire. The consequences of the investiture controversy between emperors and popes, which had lasted for decades, were still keenly felt. Royal authority was significantly weakened, and major feudal lords, especially the so-called stem dukes of Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, and Lorraine, had gained enormous autonomy and effectively ruled their territories as sovereign rulers. Central administration was virtually non-existent, and the royal domain, the king's personal lands, was insufficient for pursuing a strong policy. In this atmosphere of constant rivalry and struggle for influence, Frederick's lineage was not just significant, but truly fateful. His father was Frederick II, Duke of Swabia, known as the One-Eyed, a nickname likely earned from a wound sustained at the Battle of Flockheim in 1115. The Hohenstaufens, or Staufens, were a relatively young but extremely ambitious dynasty whose holdings were concentrated in Swabia and Franconia. They had already staked their claim to the German crown after the Salian dynasty ended in 1125, when Frederick the One-Eyed's uncle, also named Frederick, was not elected king, losing to Lothair of Supplenburg. Frederick's mother was Judith of Bavaria, daughter of Henry the Black, Duke of Bavaria, and Wulfhilda of Saxony, which connected her to the Saxon nobility as well. Judith belonged to the powerful and ancient Welf dynasty. The Welfs were one of the wealthiest and most influential dynasties in Germany. Their lands stretched from the North Sea to the Alps, and they were traditionally the main political opponents and rivals of the Hohenstaufens in the struggle for supreme power, especially after Lothair of Supplenburg, having become king and then emperor, made his son-in-law, Henry the Proud of the Welf dynasty, his heir. In Italy, where this struggle found its continuation and particular ferocity, supporters of the Hohenstaufens came to be called Ghibellines, a word derived from a distorted name of one of the Staufen ancestral castles, Weiblingen. This nickname was probably first heard at the Battle of Weinsberg in 1140. Supporters of the Welfs and their allies, including the Papacy, were called Guelfs, after the Welf dynasty. Thus, the marriage of Frederick the One-Eyed and Judith of Bavaria, concluded in 1119 or 1120, was not just a dynastic union, but a carefully considered political maneuver, a bold attempt, if not to completely reconcile the two irreconcilable warring factions, then at least to create a basis for future compromise and strengthen the Hohenstaufen position. Thanks to this union, young Frederick, the future Barbarossa, was from birth connected by blood ties to both leading political forces in Germany, which later played a key role in his election to the royal throne, but also condemned him to a lifelong balancing act between the interests of powerful relatives and the need to defend the unity of the empire. From his earliest years, he was immersed in an atmosphere of complex dynastic calculations, political intrigues, and military clashes, which undoubtedly shaped his character and worldview. He received an upbringing appropriate to his high status. He was taught hunting, the art of weaponry, sword, spear, shield, horsemanship, the basics of tactics and strategy, knightly manners, and courtly behavior. Undoubtedly, he was taught to read and write, probably in Latin, which was the language of the church and official documentation, although the extent of his education in scholarly matters is debated. Some chroniclers, such as Otto of Freising, his maternal uncle and a renowned historian, noted his quick wit and curiosity. His first political experience was participation in the affairs of the Duchy of Swabia after his father's death in 1147, when he inherited the title of Duke of Swabia as Frederick III. One of the most important stages in his development and acquisition of life experience was his participation in the Second Crusade. This crusade was organized in response to the fall of Edessa, one of the first Crusader states, captured by Muslims in 1144. Frederick went to the Holy Land with his uncle, King Conrad III of Germany, who led the German contingent. The crusade took place from 1147 to 1149. The German crusaders traveled overland through Hungary, then through the territory of the Byzantine Empire. Even at this stage, serious problems arose with the Byzantines, who distrusted the Crusaders and feared their numbers. In Asia Minor, the German army suffered heavy losses in clashes with the Seljuk Turks, especially at the Battle of Dorylaeum in October 1147, where Conrad's army was virtually annihilated. Conrad himself was wounded. Frederick, showing courage and resourcefulness, managed to gather the remnants of the troops and join the French Crusaders under King Louis VII. Together they reached Jerusalem, but the subsequent siege of Damascus in 1148, undertaken by the combined forces, ended in complete failure due to disagreements among the leaders and the betrayal of local Christian barons. Despite the overall catastrophic failure of the Second Crusade, for young Frederick, it was invaluable experience. He saw firsthand the magnificence and, simultaneously, the military-political weakness of the Byzantine Empire, encountered the intricacies of Eastern diplomacy, learned all the hardships of military life, the dangers of distant travels, the bitterness of defeat, and the importance of discipline and unity in an army. It was there, in the harsh conditions of the crusade, according to some chroniclers like Otto of Freising, that he displayed not only personal bravery and martial valor, but also remarkable diplomatic skills, trying to smooth over the numerous conflicts that arose between the Crusader leaders and Byzantine authorities, as well as between German and French participants. He also became closely acquainted with the political situation in the Crusader states and realized the complexity of the struggle against the Muslim world. In February 1152, King Conrad III died in Bamberg. On his deathbed, quite remarkably and unusually, he bypassed his own young son, the 6-year-old Frederick of Rothenburg, and designated his nephew, the 30-year-old Frederick, Duke of Swabia, as the most worthy and capable successor. Conrad handed him the royal insignia, crown, scepter, and orb, and secured the support of influential princes present at his death, such as Bishop Eberhard II of Bamberg. This choice was not accidental. The German kingdom at that time was weakened by internal strife, which continued even after Conrad's election. He was never crowned emperor in Rome. Influential princes, dukes, and counts possessed enormous autonomy and were not eager to submit to strong central monarchical authority. The country, torn by feudal strife, urgently needed a leader capable of uniting warring factions and restoring order. Frederick, who by blood was connected to both the Hohenstaufens through his father and the Welfs through his mother, seemed to many an ideal compromise figure, capable of reconciling long-standing adversaries. His personal qualities, energy, decisiveness, military experience, eloquence, as well as his attractive appearance. He was tall, fair-haired, with a characteristic reddish beard that earned him the nickname Barbarossa. Also played in his favor On March 4th, 1152, in Frankfurt am Main, an assembly of German princes, the so-called Hoftag, consisting of high nobility and clergy, almost unanimously elected Frederick King of Germany. Among his electors were key figures such as the archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier, as well as dukes and margraves. An important role in his election was played by the support of his cousin, the young Henry the Lion of the Welf dynasty, who hoped for the restoration of his rights to Bavaria. Just 5 days later, on March 9th in Aachen, the ancient capital of Charlemagne's empire, his solemn coronation took place. Aachen Cathedral, where Charlemagne's remains rested, was a symbolic place. And Frederick, from the very beginning, positioned himself as a direct heir to the great Frankish emperor, striving to revive the former might and sacral character of the empire, using the term sacred empire, in Latin, sacrum imperium, which began to come into use precisely under him. From the first days of his reign, Frederick set himself truly grandiose goals. He intended to restore and strengthen the authority of royal power in Germany itself, to subordinate the willful and powerful princes to his will, to assert the undisputed dominance of the empire in the rich Italian lands, and, equally importantly, to achieve recognition of his supremacy by the papal throne, which increasingly claimed the role of supreme arbiter in the affairs of all Christian Europe, relying on the doctrine of the two swords. The first years of Frederick's reign were entirely devoted to establishing order and strengthening his position within Germany. He acted as a wise and far-sighted politician, understanding that without a solid base in the German lands, his Italian ambitions were doomed to failure. Instead of immediately entering into open confrontation with the most powerful dukes, he sought to win them over by making certain concessions, granting privileges, and confirming their possessions, while unequivocally making it clear who the supreme overlord in the empire was. One of his first steps was to settle the dispute over the Duchy of Bavaria. He confirmed the rights of Henry Jasomirgott of the House of Babenberg to Austria, which was separated from Bavaria and elevated to a duchy in 1156 by a document known as the Privilegium Minus, while Bavaria was given to his powerful cousin Henry the Lion of the Welf dynasty. This was in addition to the Duchy of Saxony, which Henry the Lion already possessed. Thus, Henry the Lion became the most powerful prince in Germany, concentrating vast territories and resources in his hands. At that moment, this move proved justified. Henry the Lion became a loyal and active ally of the emperor, supporting him in many endeavors, including his Italian campaigns. Frederick also actively pursued a policy of general territorial peace, or Landfrieden in German. This system of measures was aimed at suppressing internal feudal wars, strife, and banditry, which undermined the stability and economic development of the country. At imperial diets, for example, in Ulm in 1152 and Würzburg in 1157, decrees were passed prohibiting private wars and establishing procedures for peaceful dispute resolution. He traveled extensively through the German lands, from the Rhine to the Elbe, personally raspberried disputes between feudal lords, strictly punishing violators of the established order, such as the Rhenish Palatines, thereby demonstrating his royal authority and determination. He also sought to rely on imperial ministerials, service people directly dependent on the king, and on the growing towns, granting them privileges in exchange for support and financial aid. However, Frederick Barbarossa's main thoughts and ambitions were directed beyond the Alps, to Italy. In the 12th century, the Italian lands were an extremely diverse and politically fragmented entity. Northern Italy, Lombardy, and Tuscany was dotted with rich and virtually independent city communes, such as Milan, Pavia, Cremona, Bologna, Genoa, Pisa, Florence, and many others. These cities had achieved prosperity through the development of crafts, cloth-making, metalworking, banking, and especially international trade, including with Byzantium, the Levant, and North Africa. They had their own self-governing bodies, such as consuls and councils, their own legislation, known as statutes, as well as militias and finances. They jealously guarded their autonomy and were unwilling to submit to any external authority, be it emperor or pope, although they were formally considered part of the empire. In the central part of the Apennine Peninsula lay the Papal States, or the patrimony of St. Peter, the secular possessions of the Roman pontiffs, stretching from Rome to Ravenna. The popes sought not only to preserve, but also to expand their possessions and assert their theocratic authority over the entire Christian world. Southern Italy and Sicily belonged to the strong and centralized Norman kingdom, founded in 1130 by Roger II. This kingdom, possessing a powerful fleet and army, pursued an independent policy and often clashed with both popes and German emperors. Frederick Barbarossa viewed Italy as an integral and crucial part of his Holy Roman Empire, in accordance with the concept of translatio imperii, the transfer of imperial authority from the Romans through the Franks to the Germans. He saw it not only as a source of significant revenue, which could replenish the imperial treasury through taxes from wealthy cities and the use of imperial regalia, but also as a guarantee of the prestige and power of his authority. He dreamed of restoring the empire to the borders of Charlemagne's time and the subsequent Ottonian emperors, when German rulers truly dominated the Apennine Peninsula and controlled the appointment of popes. In October 1154, Frederick, having assembled an impressive knightly army estimated at about 1,800 knights and a significant number of infantry, set out on his first Italian campaign. His goals were complex and ambitious. Firstly, he sought to receive the imperial crown from the hands of the Pope in Rome, which would officially confirm his supreme status among Christian monarchs and legitimize his authority over Italy. Secondly, he intended to assert his so-called regalia, or supreme imperial rights, over the northern Italian city communes. These regalia included the right to appoint officials, administer justice, collect taxes and duties, mint coins, build fortifications, receive military aid, and much more. Thirdly, Frederick planned to assist the then Pope Adrian IV. Adrian was English by birth, his real name being Nicholas Breakspere, and he remains the only Englishman to have sat on the papal throne. Adrian IV, elected in 1154, was at that moment engaged in a fierce struggle with the Roman city commune, which sought independence from papal authority, and with a republican movement led by the charismatic preacher Arnold of Brescia. Arnold of Brescia was a vivid and controversial figure of the time. He was a canon, a student of the famous philosopher Peter Abelard, and a passionate preacher who denounced the wealth and secular power of the clergy, calling for the Church to return to the ideals of apostolic poverty and for the creation in Rome of a secular republic on the ancient model, independent of papal control. His ideas found a wide response among ordinary Romans, dissatisfied with the rule of popes and nobles, but they enraged and alarmed Adrian IV and the church hierarchy, who saw him as a dangerous heretic and rebel. Frederick Barbarossa acted in Italy with his characteristic decisiveness and firmness. Crossing the Alps via the Brenner Pass, he arrived in Lombardy. On the Roncaglia plains, near Piacenza, in November-December 1154, he convened a large imperial diet to which representatives of Italian cities, as well as nobility and clergy, were invited. There, he clearly and unequivocally demanded that the Italian communes recognize his supreme rights and commit to paying imperial taxes. The cities, not expecting such pressure and lacking a united front of resistance at that moment, initially had to submit and swear an oath of allegiance. Even mighty and traditionally rebellious Milan, the richest and most influential city in Lombardy, temporarily acquiesced, albeit with clear reluctance. However, not everything went smoothly. The city of Asti in Piedmont, daring to show disobedience, was demonstratively destroyed. Chieri was also taken and punished. Tortona, a longtime ally of Milan, offered stubborn resistance and was besieged by imperial troops. The siege lasted 2 months, from February to April 1155, and involved the use of siege engines. After Tortona was taken, it was also burned and plundered. This was a brutal demonstration of force, intended to intimidate the other Italian communes and show the seriousness of Frederick's intentions. Frederick then moved his army towards Rome. On the way, he was crowned in Pavia, the ancient capital of the Lombard kingdom, with the Iron Crown of Lombardy emphasizing his rights to Italy. His meeting with Pope Adrian IV took place in June 1155 near Sutri. It was fraught with complex ceremony and was not without friction, vividly illustrating the tense relations between imperial and papal power. The Pope demanded that Frederick, according to ancient custom, perform the so-called strater service. That is, hold the Pope's stirrup as he dismounted, and then lead the horse by the bridle for a short time as a sign of respect and symbolic recognition of the supremacy of spiritual power over secular. Frederick, a proud and imperious monarch who considered himself equal to the Pope, if not superior, initially flatly refused to perform this ritual, finding it humiliating to imperial dignity. A tense situation arose, threatening to derail the negotiations and coronation. Only after long persuasion from his advisors and bishops, who reminded him that even his illustrious predecessors, such as Lothair III, had performed this custom, did Frederick reluctantly agree, though according to some accounts, he did so rather awkwardly. In exchange for Frederick's promise to help suppress the Roman Republic, led by Arnold of Brescia, and for handing over Arnold himself, Pope Adrian IV agreed to perform the imperial coronation. Arnold of Brescia was soon captured by the emperor's men, handed over to papal authorities, condemned as a heretic and rebel, and executed by hanging. His body was burned at the stake, and his ashes scattered over the Tiber River, so that his numerous followers would have no relics to worship or places for pilgrimage. On June 18, 1155, Frederick Barbarossa was solemnly crowned Holy Roman Emperor in Rome's main basilica, St. Peter's. The coronation was performed by Pope Adrian IV himself. However, the festivities were short-lived. Immediately after the coronation ceremony, the Roman citizens, outraged by the brutal execution of the popular Arnold of Brescia and the presence of foreign German troops in the city, who behaved rather unceremoniously, rose in armed rebellion. For the rest of the day, fierce and bloody battles raged in the streets of the Eternal City, especially in the Vatican area. Only by late evening did Frederick's elite knightly detachments manage, with great difficulty, to suppress the revolt. But this was achieved at the cost of significant losses among both German soldiers and the Roman population. According to some estimates, about 1,000 Romans perished. Despite obtaining the coveted imperial crown, Frederick's position in Italy remained extremely precarious and unstable. His army, exhausted by the long campaign, skirmishes and diseases like malaria, prevalent in the marshy surroundings of Rome, especially in summer, had thinned considerably. Many German princes were eager to return home. Pope Adrian IV, having achieved the elimination of his enemies in Rome with Frederick's help, began to show increasing independence and fear of the excessive strengthening of imperial power in Italy. Soon, he even entered into the Concordat of Benevento in 1156 with the empire's traditional enemies in southern Italy, the Norman king William I, the Bad of Sicily, recognizing his royal title and possessions, which was a direct challenge to imperial claims on southern Italy. Frederick, Realizing his lack of forces for further struggle and the need to restore order in Germany, where conflicts were also brewing, was forced to leave Italy in September 1155 and return across the Alps. He took with him the imperial title, but left Italy as fragmented and rebellious as it had been before his arrival. The First Italian campaign brought him the supreme symbol of power, but solved none of the fundamental problems he faced on the Apennine Peninsula. The struggle for Italy, for the real embodiment of the imperial idea, was only just beginning. Returning to Germany, Frederick Barbarossa set about strengthening his power within the kingdom with renewed energy and meticulously preparing for his next, more large-scale campaign in Italy. He understood perfectly well that without complete and real subjugation of the rich Italian lands, his empire could not achieve the might and splendor he dreamed of. He held several important diets where issues of internal governance were resolved. At the Diet of Würzburg in October 1157, he achieved reconciliation between the Archbishop of Mainz and the Count Palatine of the Rhine, and also strengthened his alliance with Henry the Lion. He also actively engaged in expanding his Hohenstaufen family domain in Swabia and Franconia, acquiring new lands and castles. Meanwhile, the conflict with the papacy not only did not subside, but took on increasingly acute forms. In October 1157, at the Imperial Diet in Besançon, located in Burgundy, which was also formerly part of the empire, papal legates, Cardinals Roland Bandinelli, the future Pope Alexander III, and Bernard, delivered a message from Adrian IV to Frederick. This message, among other things, mentioned that the Pope had granted Frederick the imperial crown and was ready to offer him other benefits, Latin, beneficia. The word beneficium in the medieval lexicon had a dual meaning. It could be interpreted simply as a kindness or favor, but also, and this was a more common meaning in feudal law, it meant a fief, a landholding or office granted by a suzerain to his vassal in exchange for service and loyalty. The imperial chancellor, Reynald of Dassel, Archbishop of Cologne, a highly educated, eloquent, and resolute man, and a proponent of strong imperial power, immediately and publicly interpreted this phrase as a clear attempt by the Pope to declare the emperor his vassal, thereby placing papal authority above imperial. Frederick flew into an indescribable rage. According to eyewitnesses, he nearly ordered the papal legates executed on the spot, especially after Cardinal Roland defiantly retorted, "From whom then did the emperor receive his power, if not from the Lord Pope?" Only the decisive intervention of German bishops and some princes, fearing a complete break with Rome and its consequences, prevented the execution of the envoys. The legates were ordered to leave Germany immediately. This Besançon incident, as historians called it, further exacerbated the already tense relations between the emperor and the Pope, preparing the ground for a long and fierce struggle for supremacy, for the Dominium Mundi fund Schom, world dominion. Adrian IV later tried to smooth things over, explaining that the word beneficium was used in the sense of good deed, Latin bonum factum, not fief, but distrust had already taken deep root. In June 1158, Frederick Barbarossa began his second Italian campaign. This time, he led an even more numerous and well-prepared army, including contingents from all major German princes, including Henry the Lion. The total strength of the army is estimated at around 100,000 men, an enormous force for that time. His main and unconcealed goal was the final subjugation of the northern Italian city communes and the establishment of a strong and effective imperial administration there, which would ensure the collection of taxes and the enforcement of imperial decrees. His first act was to again besiege Milan, which, after the emperor's departure from Italy, had once more asserted its independence, destroyed the emperor-allied city of Lodi, and refused to submit. The siege of Milan began in August 1158 and lasted about a month. The Milanese, seeing the emperor's huge army and fearing complete destruction, were forced to capitulate in September. The city pledged to pay a huge indemnity, demolish part of its fortifications, return the lands seized from Lodi, provide hostages, and accept an imperial governor. However, Frederick did not yet station his troops in Milan. Then, from November 1158 to January 1159, Frederick convened another, now famous imperial diet on the Roncaglia plains. Invited to this diet were not only German and Italian princes, bishops, and abbots, but also representatives of all significant Italian cities, and, what was an innovation and had far-reaching consequences, 4 renowned jurists from the University of Bologna, Bulgaris, Martinus Gosia, Jacobus de Porta Ravenate, and Hugo de Porta Ravenate. These 4 doctors were recognized experts in Roman law, which was then experiencing a period of revival and active study. Frederick sought to give his actions and demands a legal, juridically sound basis, relying on the principles of Roman law, which emphasized the fullness of sovereign power, according to the Roman principle. Princeps legibus solutus est. The ruler is not bound by laws. It was on the basis of these principles, as well as German feudal law, that the so-called Roncaglian constitutions, or Roncaglian laws, were formulated. These decrees unequivocally proclaimed that all regalia, supreme rights such as minting coins, collecting taxes and duties, e.g., fodder, road, and river tolls, appointing dukes, margraves, counts, and other officials, exercising supreme justice, building fortresses and castles, declaring war and peace, and the right to exploit mines, especially silver, salt works, waterways, and forests, inherently and by right, belonged exclusively to the emperor. City communes could exercise some of these rights, but only with the emperor's official permission, as his grant, and for an appropriate fee. Regalia that cities had previously usurped were to be returned to the emperor. In effect, this meant the complete liquidation of urban autonomy and self-government, for which the communes had fought for decades. For the practical administration of Italian lands and control over the cities, Frederick began to appoint his imperial officials, the so-called podesta, from Latin potestas, meaning power. These officials were to represent the emperor's interests locally, administer justice in his name, and possess broad administrative and fiscal powers. The podesta were typically Germans or Italians loyal to the emperor from families hostile to the given city. The Roncaglian constitutions, naturally, caused a storm of indignation and a wave of protests in most Italian cities, especially in Milan and its allies, such as Crema and Brescia. They saw these laws as a direct threat to their freedom, economic prosperity, and political independence. Milan, once again, offered particularly fierce resistance. As soon as the main part of the imperial army left Lombardy, Milan categorically refused to recognize the new imperial order, expelled the officials appointed by the emperor, and began preparing for armed struggle. Crema supported the Milanese. Frederick Barbarossa responded with exemplary brutality. First, he besieged Crema, which heroically resisted for 7 months, from July 1159 to January 1160. The siege was extremely cruel. Both sides used inhumane methods. For example, Frederick ordered Cremasque prisoners, including children, to be tied to his siege towers to protect them from stones thrown by the besieged. After Crema fell, it was completely destroyed. Then came Milan's turn. In 1159, after the death of Adrian IV, a schism occurred in the College of Cardinals. The majority elected Cardinal Roland Bandinelli as Pope, who took the name Alexander III and was known for his anti-imperial stance. A minority, supported by Frederick, elected Cardinal Ottaviano de Monticelli, who became anti-pope Victor IV. Frederick convened a council in Pavia in 1160, which recognized Victor IV, while Alexander III excommunicated Frederick and Victor. This marked the beginning of a long schism that lasted almost 2 decades. The siege of Milan began in the spring of 1161 and continued for almost a year, until March 1162. The city resisted desperately and heroically. Its inhabitants displayed miracles of endurance and courage. However, a prolonged blockade, famine, disease, and constant attacks by imperial troops, who systematically devastated Milan's surroundings, took their toll. In March 1162, exhausted Milan was forced to capitulate unconditionally, at the mercy of the victor. Frederick, wishing to teach a terrifying lesson to all other rebellious Italian cities and to avenge past disobedience, ordered the complete destruction of Milan's city walls, towers, and a significant portion of its buildings, with the exception of some churches. The inhabitants were ordered to disperse into 4 unfortified settlements in the vicinity, and the city itself practically ceased to exist as a major center for some time. A plow was drawn through its main streets as a sign of complete annihilation. This was an extremely harsh measure intended to break the will to resist. However, it had the completely opposite effect. The cruelty shown by Frederick towards Milan and Crema, as well as the heavy burden of imperial taxes and the tyranny of imperial officials, podesta, who often did not know local customs or language and governed despotically, united many previously feuding Italian cities. They realized that they could not withstand the might of the German emperor alone. In April 1167, at a congress in the monastery of Pontida, near Bergamo, representatives from Cremona, Bergamo, Brescia, Mantua, and then many others, including important centers like Venice, which, though formally not part of the empire, feared Frederick's strengthening, Verona, Vicenza, Padua, Treviso, Bologna, and even a rebuilt Milan, with the support of other cities, united to form the Lombard League. This was a powerful military-political alliance whose main and openly proclaimed goal was to fight against the emperor and defend urban liberties and regalia, which they considered their ancient rights. The League had its own federal body, rectors, a common treasury, and an army. The Lombard League was secretly, and at times openly, supported by Pope Alexander III, who saw it as a natural ally in his struggle against Frederick and his appointed anti-popes. Incidentally, after Victor IV's death in 1164, Frederick supported first Paschal III and then Calixtus III as anti-popes. Pope Alexander III, naturally, repeatedly confirmed Frederick's excommunication, which was a serious blow to the monarch's prestige and legitimacy in the eyes of the faithful population, and gave his enemies moral justification for resistance. Meanwhile, Frederick Barbarossa undertook several more campaigns in Italy, trying to break the Lombard League's resistance by force and assert his authority. During his 4th Italian campaign, 1166 to 1168, he even managed to capture Rome in July 1167, or rather, its left bank part, including St. Peter's Basilica, where Antipope Paschal III recrowned Frederick and his second wife, Beatrice of Burgundy. Pope Alexander III was forced to flee the city disguised as a pilgrim and hide with his allies in Benevento. It seemed the emperor was close to complete victory. However, precisely at this moment, in August 1167, a terrible epidemic, presumably malaria or some form of dysentery, exacerbated by the summer heat, broke out in his army encamped near Rome. The disease claimed the lives of thousands of German soldiers and many noble knights, including key figures like the loyal Chancellor Reinald of Dassel Archbishop of Cologne, Duke Frederick IV of Swabia, Conrad III's son, and the young Duke Welf VII, son of Welf VI, the emperor's uncle, along with many other bishops and counts. This was a devastating blow to the imperial army and Frederick's plans. He was forced to hastily retreat from Italy, his army demoralized, weakened, and suffering heavy losses. While retreating through the Mont Cenis Pass, he narrowly escaped capture by Humbert III of Savoy. The Lombard League, on the contrary, took advantage of the emperor's weakening to strengthen its position. Cities actively rebuilt, destroyed fortifications, created a common army, and coordinated their actions. In 1168, as a sign of their unity and in honor of their patron, Pope Alexander III, the League cities jointly founded a new, powerful fortress at the confluence of the Tanaro and Bormida rivers, on the border of Piedmont and Lombardy, naming it Alessandria. This fortress was to become a key stronghold in the fight against the emperor and control important roads. Frederick Barbarossa contemptuously called it Straw Alessandria, Alessandria della Paglia, alluding to the fact that its houses were initially built of wood and straw. However, this straw fortress proved to be a serious obstacle in his path, and from 1174 to 1175, withstood a months-long heavy siege by imperial troops during Frederick's fifth Italian campaign. The culmination of the long and exhausting struggle between Frederick Barbarossa and the Lombard League was the famous Battle of Legnano, which took place on May 29, 1176. Frederick, having gathered a new army after the unsuccessful siege of Alessandria and awaiting reinforcements from Germany led by Archbishop Philip of Cologne, moved north from Pavia, attempting to link up with them while simultaneously threatening Milan. The army of the Lombard League, consisting of militias from Milan, Brescia, Novara, Piacenza, and other cities, marched out to meet him. The imperial army had a significant advantage in heavy knightly cavalry, which was considered the main strike force of medieval armies. The Lombard League's army consisted mainly of urban militia, well-trained and disciplined infantrymen, armed with long pikes, spears, halberds, and crossbows, with only a small contingent of cavalry. The central element of the Lombard battle formation and a symbol of their resistance was the so-called carroccio, a large, richly decorated wagon drawn by oxen. An altar for religious services, a cross, and the main banner of the city, in this case Milan or the League, were mounted on the carroccio. Elite warriors, ready to die rather than allow its capture, were stationed around it. Losing the carroccio was considered the greatest disgrace and signified defeat. The battle began with an attack by the German knightly cavalry, which clashed with the Lombard cavalry vanguard near Borsano. The Lombard cavalry was quickly overwhelmed and routed. Then the German knights, pursuing the retreating Lombards, fell upon the main Lombard infantry forces, which had formed a dense square around the carroccio near Legnano. It seemed the outcome of the battle was decided, and the emperor's victory was near. But the Lombard infantrymen, rallying around their carroccio, displayed unprecedented steadfastness and courage. They presented a wall of spears and pikes, against which the furious attacks of the heavy German cavalry repeatedly broke. In the heat of the battle, Frederick Barbarossa, who, as always, fought personally in the front ranks of his warriors, had his horse killed under him, and the emperor himself fell to the ground. The imperial standard was captured. A rumor of his death instantly spread through his troops. This caused confusion, then panic, among the German knights. At this critical moment, the previously retreating Lombard cavalry, having regrouped and received reinforcements from a Brescian detachment, and possibly the legendary Company of Death, a unit of 900 young knights sworn to conquer or die. For Milan's freedom, though the existence of this unit is disputed by some historians, struck the Germans in the flank and rear. The imperial army, deprived of unified command, attacked from several sides, and gripped by panic, wavered and fled in disarray towards the Ticino River. Many German knights drowned while crossing or were taken prisoner. Frederick himself, who miraculously avoided capture or death, was considered dead or missing for several days until he, exhausted, wounded, but alive, appeared in Pavia, one of the few Italian cities that had remained loyal to the empire. The defeat at the Battle of Legnano was a severe military and moral blow for Frederick Barbarossa and a turning point in his entire Italian policy. He finally realized that he could not break the stubborn resistance of the Italian city communes by brute military force, nor could he overcome Pope Alexander III, who was supported by most of the Christian world and skillfully used the victory at Legnano in his propaganda. The emperor was forced to negotiate and compromise. Preliminary negotiations began in Anagni as early as 1176. In 1177, in Venice, after complex and lengthy diplomatic efforts involving representatives of the Venetian Republic and the Kingdom of Sicily, a peace treaty was concluded between Frederick Barbarossa and Pope Alexander III, as well as a 6-year truce with the Lombard League and a 15-year truce with King William II, the Good of Sicily. Frederick officially recognized Alexander III as the legitimate pope, renounced his support for anti-pope Calixtus III, who was, however, allowed to retain some ecclesiastical benefices, and pledged to return to the church all previously seized possessions and rights, including the prefecture of Rome. The pope, in turn, lifted the excommunication from the emperor and his supporters and recognized his imperial title. In Venice, on July 24, 1177, the famous scene of public reconciliation between Frederick and Alexander III took place before St. Mark's Basilica. According to some, possibly exaggerated accounts by chroniclers, Frederick knelt before the Pope and even kissed his shoe as a sign of humility, although more reliable sources speak of a less demeaning procedure. The very fact of reconciliation was an act of immense symbolic significance, demonstrating that even a mighty emperor had to reckon with the authority of the Church. Negotiations with the Lombard League dragged on for a longer period, during which the truce remained in effect. Only on June 25, 1183, in the city of Constance, on Lake Constance, was the definitive Peace of Constance signed. This treaty was the result of a complex compromise between imperial claims and the city's desire for independence, effectively consolidating the results of the Battle of Legnano. The cities of the Lombard League formally recognized the emperor's supreme authority and swore an oath of allegiance to him. They also agreed to the investiture of their consuls by the emperor or his legate, to the emperor's right of appellate jurisdiction, and to providing traditional supplies of fodder, known as fodrum, for imperial troops during their passage through Italy. However, the cities retained most of their regalia, i.e., rights to self-government, including the right to elect their consuls and other officials, to have their own legislation, statutes, and courts, to collect taxes, mint coins, build and maintain fortifications, form military alliances, and maintain their own troops. Imperial officials, podesta, if appointed, were to be citizens of the given city or region, approved by the cities themselves, and swear an oath to uphold city laws. In effect, the Peace of Constance meant the recognition of broad autonomy for the northern Italian cities within the framework of the Holy Roman Empire. Although Frederick Barbarossa did not achieve all his initial goals in Italy, and his dream of completely subjugating the Apennine Peninsula remained unfulfilled, the Peace of Constance brought long-awaited peace and stability to war-torn Lombardy. For almost half a century, this allowed the emperor to finally turn his attention to other pressing matters, primarily strengthening his power in Germany and preparing for a dynastic union with the Kingdom of Sicily. In subsequent years, Frederick visited Italy several more times, for example during his Sixth Italian campaign, 1184 to 1186, but no longer for war, but to strengthen peaceful relations, hold diets, e.g. in Milan, where he celebrated his son's wedding, and assert his authority as supreme overlord. While Frederick Barbarossa waged exhausting and costly wars in Italy for nearly a quarter of a century, his most powerful vassal in Germany, the aforementioned Henry the Lion of the Welf dynasty, Duke of Saxony and Bavaria, significantly strengthened his position and expanded his possessions to unprecedented dimensions. Henry the Lion was an extremely active, ambitious, and often ruthless ruler. He actively pursued a policy of colonization and Christianization of Slavic lands east of the Elbe, in the regions of Mecklenburg, Pomerania, and Brandenburg. The so-called Drang nach Osten, drive to the east. This expansion was accompanied by the founding of new bishoprics, such as Ratzeburg, Schwerin, and Oldenburg, which later became Lübeck. And these bishoprics became strongholds of German influence and Christian missionary work. He founded new cities or significantly expanded existing ones. Among them were important centers such as Munich, founded in 1158 on lands taken from the Bishop of Freising. Lübeck, rebuilt and granted city rights in 1159, which became a key port on the Baltic, Schwerin, Brunswick, which Henry the Lion made his magnificent residence, building Dankwarterode Castle and St. Blaise's Cathedral there, as well as Lüneburg and Stade. Henry the Lion actively patronized trade, especially on the Baltic Sea, where Lübeck quickly became the center of the future Hanseatic League. He developed mining, especially silver mining in the Harz Mountains, which brought him enormous revenues. He minted his own coins, built numerous castles and roads, and reformed the administration of his vast territories, striving for centralization. His power and wealth were so immense that he ruled his lands almost like an independent monarch, paying little heed to the interests of the emperor and other German princes, and even conducted his own foreign policy, concluding treaties, for example, with the kings of Denmark and England. His court in Brunswick rivaled the imperial court in splendor. Relations between Frederick Barbarossa and Henry the Lion, once allied and even friendly, they were cousins, and Frederick had greatly contributed to Henry's rise, gradually deteriorated, developing into hidden, then open enmity. There were several reasons for this. Firstly, Henry the Lion's excessive strengthening itself caused concern for Frederick, who saw him as a potential rival capable of challenging imperial authority. Secondly, Henry the Lion's aggressive policy, aimed at expanding his possessions, often led to conflicts with other German princes and bishops, such as the archbishops of Magdeburg and Bremen, the bishops of Hildesheim and Halberstadt, and the margraves of Brandenburg of the Ascanian dynasty, who were his neighbors and rivals. These princes constantly complained to the emperor about Welf suppression. Thirdly, Henry the Lion, focusing on his affairs in northern Germany and the Baltic, became increasingly reluctant to participate in the emperor's costly and risky Italian campaigns, which diverted his forces and resources. The last straw for Frederick was Henry the Lion's demonstrative refusal to provide military aid to the emperor during the Fifth Italian Campaign, before the decisive phase of the struggle with the Lombard League in 1176. There is a famous tradition, possibly embellished by later chroniclers, but reflecting the essence of the conflict, that Frederick met Henry the Lion in Chiavenna on his way to Italy, and personally, even kneeling, begged his powerful cousin for military support, promising him any favors. However, Henry the Lion remained adamant. In exchange for his help, he demanded the rich imperial city of Goslar with its famous silver mines in the Harz, which had long been a subject of dispute between him and the emperor. Frederick could not and would not stoop to such humiliation and concession of a strategically important resource, considering the demand excessive and insulting. He never forgot or forgave what he considered a betrayal at a critical moment for the empire, which, in his opinion, greatly contributed to the defeat at Legnano. Returning to Germany after concluding the Peace of Venice with Pope Alexander III and temporarily settling Italian affairs, Frederick Barbarossa, feeling more confident, decided to definitively put an end to Henry the Lion's excessive power and independence. In this endeavor, he found many allies among other German princes and bishops who had long viewed Welf's growing power and wealth with envy and apprehension, and had themselves suffered from his aggressive policies or feared becoming his next victims. A formal pretext for initiating proceedings against Henry the Lion was quickly found. Bishop Ulrich of Halberstadt and other Saxon princes lodged a complaint with the emperor against Henry, accusing him of violating the territorial peace and illegally seizing their possessions. In 1179, at the imperial diet in Worms, a formal judicial process was initiated against Henry the Lion. He was accused of a whole range of crimes: violating the imperial peace, disobeying the emperor's orders, e.g., failing to appear at diets and refusing military service, illegally seizing others' lands, and oppressing his vassals. Henry the Lion was summoned 3 times to the imperial court, to diets in Magdeburg, Kaina, and Goslar, to answer the charges. However, Henry the Lion, understanding that the court would be biased against him and fearing for his safety, refused to appear each time, citing various reasons or simply ignoring the summons. His non-appearance was interpreted as an admission of guilt and as the crime of contumaciam, contempt of court. In January 1180, at the Diet in Würzburg, attended mainly by Henry the Lion's enemies, he was found guilty of violating his feudal oath and rebellion. Based on this verdict, delivered by a court of princes, he was deprived of all his imperial fiefs, that is, the duchies of Saxony and Bavaria, as well as numerous other possessions he held from the empire, such as counties and bailiwicks. Then, in April 1180, at another diet in Gelnhausen, which was more representative, Frederick Barbarossa officially announced the confiscation of Henry the Lion's possessions and proceeded to redistribute them. His vast lands were divided among other princes who had demonstrated their loyalty to the emperor or simply sought to profit from the fallen giant. The Duchy of Saxony was divided into several parts. Its western part, Westphalia, along with the title of Duke of Westphalia, was given to Archbishop Philip of Cologne, who was one of the main instigators of the proceedings against Henry. The eastern part of Saxony, along with the title of Duke of Saxony, was given to Bernard of Anhalt of the Ascanian dynasty, son of Albert the Bear, a longtime rival of the Welfs. Other parts of Saxony went to various counts and bishops. The Duchy of Bavaria was significantly reduced. Styria was separated and also elevated to a duchy, going to Ottokar IV. The remaining part of Bavaria was given to Count Otto of Wittelsbach, a loyal supporter of Frederick, who had distinguished himself at Legnano. His descendants, the Wittelsbach dynasty, ruled Bavaria until 1918. Henry the Lion tried to resist this decision with arms. He fortified himself in his Saxon possessions and for some time successfully repelled attacks from his enemies. However, his forces were incomparable to the combined forces of the emperor and his numerous allies. Moreover, many of his own vassals, dissatisfied with his harsh rule, defected to the emperor. After a series of defeats, particularly after losing Lübeck, which came under direct imperial administration, and Brunswick, Henry the Lion was forced, in November 1181, to appear at the Diet in Erfurt and submit to Frederick Barbarossa. He fell at the emperor's feet, begging for forgiveness. Frederick, showing some mercy, perhaps not wanting to set a precedent for the complete destruction of one of the empire's noblest families, or perhaps influenced by English diplomacy. As Henry the Lion was the son-in-law of King Henry II of England, allowed Henry the Lion to retain his hereditary allodial possessions around Brunswick and Lüneburg, as well as some lands in Nordalbingia. However, Henry the Lion himself was sentenced to 3 years of exile from Germany. He found refuge at the court of his father-in-law, King Henry II Plantagenet of England, and spent these years in England and Normandy. Returning to Germany in 1185, he again tried to regain his lost positions, but unsuccessfully. He finally reconciled with Frederick's son, Henry VI, after Barbarossa's death in 1194, and died in 1195 in Brunswick. The fall of Henry the Lion was one of the greatest triumphs of Frederick Barbarossa's domestic policy. The emperor got rid of his most dangerous and powerful internal rival, and demonstrably asserted his supreme authority over all German princes. He also showed that he could use feudal law and the imperial court to achieve his political goals. The division of Henry the Lion's vast possessions, though leading to further territorial fragmentation in Germany as more small and medium-sized principalities emerged, in the short term significantly strengthened the emperor's own authority and influence. Frederick could now more confidently pursue his policies both in Germany and abroad. In the following years, from 1181 to 1188, Frederick Barbarossa actively engaged in the internal affairs of the empire, striving to strengthen central authority as much as possible under the conditions of developed feudalism. He tried to regularize legislation, issuing new laws aimed at maintaining peace and order. An important area of his activity was the establishment of the so-called General Territorial Peace, or Landfrieden. At Diets, for example, in Nuremberg in 1186, decrees were passed prohibiting private wars, German Fehde, and establishing strict penalties for their violation. He also encouraged the development of cities, which became his support in the fight against feudal license, and an important source of revenue. He granted many cities privileges, charters, and rights of self-government, making them imperial cities directly subordinate to him. He promoted trade and crafts and the improvement of roads and bridges. In 1184, in Mainz, Frederick hosted a grand and lavish court festival, the so-called Mainz Hoftag, or Whitsun Festival, which, according to chroniclers, attracted tens of thousands of knights. Figures from 40,000 to 70,000 are mentioned, as well as princes, bishops, and nobles from all over Europe, including ambassadors from England, France, Hungary, Byzantium, and even from Saladin. This festival lasted several days and was accompanied by nightly tournaments, feasts, church services, and political negotiations. During this festival, his sons, the 20-year-old Henry, already crowned German king in 1169, and the 17-year-old Frederick, Duke of Swabia, were solemnly knighted. This was an impressive demonstration of the power, splendor, wealth, and unity of the Holy Roman Empire under Hohenstaufen rule, as well as a demonstration of reconciliation and concord within the German nobility after Henry the Lion's fall. Frederick also sought to strengthen his dynasty's position. He secured the election of his son Henry as his co-ruler and heir, ensuring the succession of power. A crucial achievement of his dynastic diplomacy was arranging the marriage of his eldest son and heir, Henry, to Constance of Sicily. Constance, born in 1154, was the daughter of Roger II, the first king of Sicily, and the aunt of the then childless King William II, the Good of Sicily. As William II had no direct heirs, Constance was considered his potential successor. The wedding of Henry and Constance, who was already 32 years old, took place on January 27, 1186 in Milan, with unprecedented magnificence. This marriage opened a real prospect for the Hohenstaufen dynasty to acquire the rich and strategically important Kingdom of Sicily, which included not only the island of Sicily, but also a significant part of southern Italy, including Apulia, Calabria, and Campania. This had been a long-standing dream of many German emperors, as uniting Sicily with the empire would give them control over the entire Apennine Peninsula and the Mediterranean, as well as access to the vast financial and military resources of the Sicilian kingdom, which was famed for its developed administration, mixed population, Normans, Greeks, Arabs, Lombards, and tolerance of different cultures. However, this dynastic success of the Hohenstaufens caused serious concern for the papacy. The popes, particularly the then Pope Urban III and his successors, categorically objected to this union, fearing being completely surrounded by Hohenstaufen possessions, from the north by the Holy Roman Empire and from the south by the Kingdom of Sicily. This could have led to the complete loss of the Papal State's independence and the subordination of papal authority to the emperors, which the Roman pontiffs sought to avoid at all costs. This conflict over the Sicilian inheritance would become one of the main causes of the fierce struggle between the Hohenstaufens and the papacy in the 13th century, after Frederick Barbarossa's death. In October 1187, the Christian world was shocked and horrified by the news of the devastating defeat of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's forces and the fall of the Holy City of Jerusalem. The great Muslim commander and ruler of Egypt and Syria, Sultan Saladin, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, inflicted a crushing defeat on the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin on July 4, 1187, where virtually the entire army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, including King Guy of Lusignan and the master of the Knights Templar, Gerard de Riedfort, was annihilated or captured. Then, after a short siege, on October 2, 1187, Saladin captured Jerusalem, which had been in Christian hands for almost 90 years since the First Crusade in 1099. Only a few coastal cities, such as Tyre, Tripoli, and Antioch, remained in Christian hands. This tragic event caused a powerful wave of indignation, grief, and calls for vengeance throughout Europe. Pope Gregory VIII, shortly after his election, issued the bull Audita Tremendi on October 29, 1187, calling on Christian monarchs and knights for a new Third Crusade to reconquer the Holy Sepulchre and other holy sites from the infidels. Preachers of the Crusade traveled throughout Europe. Frederick Barbarossa was by this time about 65 or 66 years old, a very advanced age for that era, when average life expectancy was considerably shorter, and a monarch's life was full of dangers and hardships. He had already achieved much. His empire enjoyed relative peace and stability after the pacification of Italy and the fall of Henry the Lion. He could have peacefully spent the rest of his days in his German or Italian domains, enjoying the fruits of his long labors and preparing the transfer of power to his son Henry. But the news of Jerusalem's loss deeply moved and outraged the old emperor. As a Christian monarch, bearing the title of Defender of the Faith and the Holy Roman Empire, he considered it his sacred duty to lead the crusade and personally participate in the liberation of the Holy Land. He remembered his participation in the unsuccessful Second Crusade and perhaps sought to atone for that failure. Moreover, participating in a crusade was a matter of the highest honor, prestige, and piety for any medieval ruler, and even more so for an emperor. It was a chance to strengthen his authority as leader of the Christian world and perhaps earn divine favor for himself and his dynasty. In March 1188, at a solemn imperial diet in Mainz, which contemporaries called the Diet of Christ, Latin Curia Christi, because of its main purpose, Frederick Barbarossa, in the presence of the papal legate, Cardinal Henry of Albano, and numerous princes, bishops, and knights, solemnly took the cross, i.e., vowed to go on crusade. His example was immediately followed by many noble feudal lords, including his second son, Duke Frederick VI of Swabia, Duke Leopold V of Austria, Landgrave Louis III of Thuringia, and many others. Thousands of German knights, barons, as well as common soldiers and pilgrims, inspired by the prospect of fighting for the faith under the leadership of their renowned and experienced emperor, also took the cross. Preparations for the campaign were conducted with Frederick's characteristic German thoroughness, meticulousness, and scale. He threw himself into this task with youthful zeal. A huge army was assembled. According to various estimates by contemporaries and historians, its numbers ranged from 20,000 to 100,000 men, including about 20,000 well-armed and trained knights, although a figure of 15,000 to 20,000 knights and several tens of thousands of infantry and servants is considered more realistic. This army was the largest and most combat-ready force setting out on the Third Crusade. Frederick personally ensured strict discipline in the army, reliable supplies of food and fodder, and the financial provision for the expedition. Special taxes were introduced to finance the crusade. He even issued a special decree prohibiting participation in the crusade. For those who did not have sufficient funds to sustain themselves and their horse for at least 2 years, or 3, according to other accounts. This was done to prevent the army from turning, as often happened in previous crusades, into an unmanageable mob of impoverished vagrants and marauders, who became a burden rather than a help. Before departing, he settled all disputed issues in Germany, appointing his son Henry VI as regent of the empire during his absence and reconciling, albeit temporarily, with Henry the Lion. He also conducted extensive diplomatic preparations, sending envoys to King Bela III of Hungary, Byzantine Emperor Isaac II Angelus, Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslan II of Rum, and even to Saladin himself, demanding free passage and threatening refusal with consequences. In May 1189, after a solemn religious service in Regensburg, the huge German army set out. The Crusaders' route lay overland, up the Danube through Hungary, where King Bela III gave them a friendly reception and ensured supplies. Then they entered the territory of the Byzantine Empire in the Balkans. Here, serious difficulties began. The Byzantine Emperor Isaac II Angelos, though promising assistance, actually feared such a large and well-armed German army passing through his domains. He suspected Frederick of hidden designs against Byzantium, possibly an intention to capture Constantinople, as the Normans had already attempted. Moreover, Isaac II had secretly concluded an alliance with Saladin, aimed against the Crusaders, promising to hinder their advance. As a result, Byzantine authorities created all sorts of obstacles for the German army, delaying food supplies, attacking isolated detachments, spreading false rumors. This led to several armed clashes between German crusaders and Byzantine troops, for example, near Philippopolis, modern Plovdiv, and Adrianople, modern Edirne. Frederick was forced to use force, capturing Adrianople and threatening Constantinople itself. Only after this did Isaac II, frightened, make concessions, provide hostages, ships for crossing, and promise to ensure supplies. In the spring of 1190, from March to April, the German army was transported across the Dardanelles Strait, or Hellespont, from Gallipoli to Asia Minor. In this campaign, Frederick Barbarossa once again proved himself a talented organizer, wise leader, and experienced commander. He managed to maintain strict discipline in his multinational army, decisively suppressing any attempts at looting and violence against the local population of the countries through which the Crusaders passed, even despite provocations. This was particularly important for preserving the army's combat capability. In Asia Minor, in the territory of the Sultanate of Rum, ruled by the Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslan II and his sons, knew even more severe trials awaited the German crusaders. The path lay through hostile, arid, mountainous, and sparsely populated lands of the Anatolian plateau. Constant surprise attacks by light Turkish cavalry using hit-and-run tactics exhausted the army. An acute shortage of drinking water and food, as the Turks poisoned wells and destroyed crops, debilitating heat during the day and cold at night, as well as diseases, began to seriously affect the army's numbers and morale. However, Frederick Barbarossa, despite his advanced age and difficulties, steadfastly endured all the hardships of the campaign, and by personal example, led his warriors forward, setting an example of courage, endurance, and indomitable will. He shared all hardships with his soldiers, ate the same food, and slept on the ground. On May 18, 1190, the German crusaders won an important and brilliant victory over superior Seljuk forces under the command of Kilij Arslan's son, Qutb al-Din Melik Shah, in a bloody battle near Iconium, modern Konya, the capital of the Sultanate. In this battle, Frederick personally led the charge of his knights. After the victory, the Crusaders stormed and sacked Iconium itself, where they found large supplies of food and were able to rest for several days. This victory had great moral and strategic significance. It raised the German army's morale, inflicted serious damage on the Seljuks, and opened the way for the Crusaders further southeast, towards Cilician Armenia, a small Christian state whose rulers, particularly Levin II, were allies of the Crusaders and had promised them aid. It seemed that the most difficult trials were already behind them. The army was able to rest in Iconium and replenish its supplies of food and fodder. Ahead lay Syria and the long-awaited encounter with Saladin's army. Many believed that Frederick Barbarossa, with his mighty and battle-hardened army, would be able to change the course of the war and return Jerusalem to the Christians. Saladin, reportedly, seriously feared the arrival of the German army, but fate, as often happens, decided otherwise. On June 10, 1190, while crossing the swift and cold Salef River, now known as the Göksu, in Cilicia, southern modern Turkey, near the city of Seleucia, modern Silifke, Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa tragically drowned. The exact circumstances of his death still remain a subject of debate among historians and are shrouded in a mist of various versions and assumptions based on contradictory accounts by chroniclers. According to one of the most common versions, recounted, for example, by Ansbert, the emperor, heated by the day's march under the scorching sun and impatient, decided not to wait until a ford was found or a bridge built, but attempted to swim across the river on horseback to reach the other side more quickly. However, the current was strong and the water was icy. Perhaps being an elderly man, he suffered a heart attack or a stroke due to the sudden temperature change. According to another version, his horse slipped on slick stones or was swept away by the strong current, and the emperor, dressed probably not in full but still heavy armor, fell into the water and could not reach the shore due to the weight of his armor and the swiftness of the current. There is also a suggestion that he simply wanted to cool off and bathe, but underestimated the danger of the mountain river. Whatever the case, the great emperor, one of the most powerful rulers of his time, died not in battle, but in the waters of a small river, on the threshold of the Holy Land he so longed to reach. His body was recovered from the water by his knights. The death of Frederick Barbarossa was a terrible, irreparable blow to the entire Crusader army. The army instantly lost its universally recognized leader, its inspirer, its soul. Despondency, confusion, and disarray began among the Crusaders. Discipline plummeted. Many, especially common soldiers, considered the emperor's death a bad omen, a sign of God's wrath, or simply saw no point in continuing the crusade without their leader. Command passed to his son, Duke Frederick VI of Swabia, but he lacked his father's authority and experience. A part of the German army, demoralized by the emperor's death and seeing no prospects for continuing the campaign, turned back to Europe or dispersed across Asia Minor, trying to reach coastal ports or return home independently. Many perished at the hands of the Turks, from disease or from starvation. Only a relatively small but most resilient part of the army, numbering about 5,000 men, led by Duke Frederick of Swabia, continued the mournful journey to the Holy Land. They carried with them the body of their emperor, which they tried to preserve from decomposition for an honorable burial in Jerusalem. Attempts at embalming under campaign conditions proved unsuccessful. It was then decided, according to the German custom known as mos teutonicus, to separate the flesh from the bones by boiling the body in wine or water. Frederick Barbarossa's flesh was buried in St. Peter's Cathedral in Antioch, where the remnants of the German army arrived at the end of June. His bones were placed in a special casket and were intended to be taken to Tyre and then to Jerusalem. However, Duke Frederick of Swabia died of malaria during the siege of Acre in January 1191, and his father's bones were apparently buried in Tyre Cathedral. The emperor's heart and viscera, according to some accounts, were buried even earlier in Tarsus, Cilicia. Thus, ingloriously and tragically ended the German emperor's crusade, which had promised to be the most powerful, most organized, and most successful of all the enterprises of the Third Crusade. The death of Frederick Barbarossa had far-reaching and very negative consequences for the entire Crusader cause. The German army, which was the most numerous and combat-ready contingent among all armies participating in the Third Crusade, effectively dropped out of further struggle. Although King Richard I, the Lionheart of England, and King Philip II Augustus of France, who arrived in the Holy Land by sea, continued the war against Saladin and achieved some military successes, such as the capture of Acre in July 1191 and Richard's victory at Arsuf, they never managed to reconquer Jerusalem. Many contemporaries and later historians believed that if Frederick Barbarossa, with his huge army, had reached Palestine, the outcome of the Third Crusade might have been completely different, and Jerusalem might have been returned to the Christians. Frederick Barbarossa left a deep and indelible mark on the history of medieval Europe. He was, without doubt, one of the most outstanding, active, and charismatic rulers of his era. His long reign, lasting almost 38 years, from 1152 to 1190, was a time of significant uplift and flourishing for the Holy Roman Empire. Though it was filled with continuous struggle and numerous conflicts, he sought to revive the idea of a universal Christian empire, based on Roman traditions and German strength. Among his main achievements are the following. He managed, for a time, to strengthen royal and then imperial authority in Germany, curbing the most powerful feudal lords, such as Henry the Lion, and asserting the principle of imperial supremacy over the princes, although he could not completely overcome the country's deeply rooted feudal fragmentation. He succeeded in temporarily pacifying the rebellious northern Italian city communes, eventually achieving the compromise Peace of Constance, which, while recognizing their broad autonomy, formally kept them within the empire and secured certain rights and revenues for the emperor. Frederick pursued an active and often aggressive foreign policy, striving to assert the prestige and influence of the Holy Roman Empire on the international stage, intervening in the affairs of Poland, Bohemia, Hungary, Denmark, and Burgundy. He was also known as a patron of culture and the arts, though to a lesser extent than his grandson Frederick II. Minnesingers, German knightly poets and singers like Friedrich von Hausen or Heinrich von Weldeke flourished at his court. Romanesque architecture developed. New cathedrals were built, for example in Worms, Speyer, and Mainz. Though their construction began earlier, it continued or they were rebuilt under Frederick, as well as numerous imperial palaces, Pfalzen, such as Gelnhausen or Kaiserswerth. Under him, work on the codification of law, especially feudal law, intensified. Although famous compilations like the Sachsenspiegel and Schwabenspiegel appeared later, the groundwork was laid during his reign. Through his dynastic policy, particularly the marriage of his son Henry VI to the Sicilian heiress Constance, he laid the foundations for the further expansion of the Hohenstaufen dynasty's influence and the creation of a vast empire, encompassing Germany, Italy, and Sicily. Although this led to new, even more bitter conflicts with the Papacy and Italian cities in the future. However, his reign also had its failures, contradictions, and dark sides. He never managed to create a truly unified, centralized state. His vast empire remained more of a conglomerate of semi-independent principalities, duchies, counties, bishoprics, and free cities than a solid monarchical entity. The feudal fragmentation of Germany was not only not overcome, but perhaps even worsened as a result of Henry the Lion's fall and the division of his possessions. His ambitious Italian policy, despite colossal efforts, 6 Italian campaigns, enormous costs, and numerous casualties, never led to the complete and long-term subjugation of Italy to imperial authority. The Lombard cities defended their freedom. The cruelty he displayed in suppressing revolts, especially the demonstrative destruction of Milan in 1162 and Crema in 1160, left a dark memory and incited hatred against him in many Italian cities, although at the same time, some cities such as Pavia, Cremona, or Pisa remained his loyal allies. The long and bitter conflict with the Papacy, accompanied by a church schism that lasted from 1159 to 1177, weakened both the authority of the empire and the unity of the church itself, causing confusion in the minds and hearts of believers throughout Europe. Although Frederick reconciled with Alexander III, the deep-seated contradictions between imperial and papal power were never resolved. Despite all these complexities and contradictions, the figure of Frederick Barbarossa began to be surrounded by numerous legends and traditions, even during his lifetime. His striking appearance, especially his famous red beard that gave him his nickname. Incidentally, the Italians were the first to call him that. His personal courage and bravery displayed in many battles, his grandiose imperial designs, and his indomitable will, all this made an indelible impression on his contemporaries. And his tragic and unexpected death in a distant foreign land, on the way to the holy city of Jerusalem, in the midst of a great crusade, only enhanced the mythical aura surrounding his name. In Germany, sometime after his death, the famous legend of the sleeping emperor arose and became widespread. According to this legend, Frederick Barbarossa did not actually die, but sleeps a magical, enchanted sleep in a deep cave inside Kyffhäuser mountain in Thuringia. Though this legend was initially associated with his grandson Frederick II, it later transferred to Barbarossa, or according to another version, in Untersberg mountain near Salzburg. The legend says he sits at a large stone table, and his long red beard keeps growing and has already wrapped around the table legs several times. Ravens circle the mountain, and as long as they fly, the emperor sleeps. It is said that once every 100 years, he briefly awakens and sends one of his loyal dwarves, or a raven, to see if other ravens are still circling the mountain. If the ravens are still flying, it means the time for his return has not yet come. The hour of Germany's distress has not yet struck, and he sinks back into his deep sleep. But one day, when Germany is in greatest need and danger, when the old ravens stop circling the mountain, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa will finally awaken, emerge from his cave at the head of his loyal knights who sleep with him, and restore the former greatness, unity, and power of the German Empire, bringing his country a new golden age of peace, prosperity, and justice. This legend of the sleeping emperor was particularly popular in the 19th century, during the turbulent struggle for the unification of fragmented Germany. Frederick Barbarossa then became one of the main national symbols of German unity, power, and imperial spirit. Numerous monuments were erected to him, such as the famous monument on Kyffhäuser mountain, inaugurated in 1896. Poems were written about him, for example, by Heinrich Heine and Friedrich Rückert, as well as epics, novels, and historical works. Even the first emperor of a unified German empire, Kaiser Wilhelm I, proclaimed in 1871, was perceived by many Germans as a kind of reincarnation or long-awaited return of the great Barbarossa, the white-bearded Kaiser as heir to the red-bearded. Operation Barbarossa, the code name for Nazi Germany's plan to attack the Soviet Union in 1941, also appealed to this image, albeit in a completely distorted and criminal context. In conclusion, Frederick I Barbarossa is undoubtedly an extremely complex, multifaceted, and significant figure in European history. He was a true son of his turbulent and contradictory time, the High Middle Ages, an era of brutal wars and feudal anarchy, but also an era of flourishing knightly culture, religious enthusiasm, and grand designs. His cherished dream of creating a unified and powerful universal empire, encompassing Germany, Italy, and Burgundy, and recognized by all of Christendom as the heir to the Roman Empire, proved unachievable under those specific historical conditions. But his incredible energy, his indomitable will, his striving to establish order and justice as he understood them, left an indelible mark on the political, legal, and cultural development of Europe. He was an emperor who desperately tried to turn back the wheel of history, to halt the inexorable process of feudal disintegration, and to strengthen the already fading universalist idea of empire in an era when national states were already emerging, and the power of independent cities was rapidly growing. His life and his struggle were full of profound drama, brilliant triumphs, and tragic defeats. But that is precisely why his image remains so captivating and evokes unflagging interest among historians and all who are interested in the past to this day. The legend of the sleeping emperor, awaiting his hour in the depths of the mountain, is alive even today, reminding us of the eternal human dream of a strong, wise, and just ruler, of the coming of a golden age that will someday surely arrive. Frederick Barbarossa, the red-bearded emperor, has forever remained in the memory of generations as one of the greatest and most memorable monarchs of the Middle Ages. A vivid symbol of his era, an era full of knightly splendor and bloody battles, deep faith and immeasurable ambition. Thank you for your attention. We hope this account of the life and deeds of Frederick Barbarossa was informative for you and allowed you to better understand this complex and iconic historical figure.